Hey guys, Khalid from Cricket Fanatics Magazine here with another episode of Legends with Ravi. Now, today is a episode very close to our hearts, and I think everybody's hearts out there. And it's a message that has to be told, and it's a episode that has to be watched by everybody. It's looking back significantly in the past, and looking and reminiscing about some of the great times, some of the struggles, etc. So today, I obviously have Ravi, as you can see, with me, but we also bring in on the show Aslam Khota. So this is going to be an excellent, excellent interview and an excellent, excellent conversation that we're going to be having. I would like to say it's more of a conversation and a learning curve, especially for me and for all of you younger viewers as well out there. It's also an opportunity for all our older viewers also to reminisce on the past and get in the conversation. So don't forget to get in the comment section and give your comments in the comment section below. Of course, also get involved with all the topics that we're going to be discussing. If you have any questions, put it in. We will get to them later in the show. But before we get going, before I introduce Ravi once again, we get a chat with Ravi. Just press the like, share button, comment in the comment section below, press the notification bell if you're watching on YouTube, and let's get going. So, welcome to the show, Ravi. We've missed you. It's been a couple of weeks now without your face on this platform.
Feels like 20 whole years, hasn't it? I feel like I look like I've aged 20 years or so since we last spoke. But thanks again for having me, and I'd like to bid a warm and friendly welcome to all of our cricket fanatics in the country and, of course, worldwide. We've got some guys subscribing from India, the States, Canada, to name a few, from what I understand. And I'd like to wish you all, extend a bit of a warm welcome to you guys, and looking forward to getting into this discussion tonight.
Yeah, it's actually quite fitting, Ravi, because we obviously know that the period that we're going to be talking about, it's obviously um, when apartheid laws were in place, etc. And we know about the Black Lives Matter movement at this moment, and that has been blowing up on social media and all over the world, and it should have, and rightly so. Um, Even though we have been planning this for quite some time, it's quite fitting and goes hand in hand with what was said on Sky Sports today ahead of the England versus West Indies test with Michael Holding. And there were some very emotional things that was said. It was very difficult for me to sit there and watch one of our and many people's heroes get so emotional about this topic and on live TV, of course, and some things that Nasser Hussain was saying as well, and we could hear the quiver in his voice as well because he spoke about some things that he had to deal with as well. But mainly, Michael, did you have a chance to listen to that speech, and what did you get out of those things that were said?
Absolutely. I'd like to thank Bilal for making mention of this on Twitter, because I wasn't aware of this interview that took place before the match even started. I listened to the entire interview, and the two sort of chords which struck with me is the fact that both Michael and Nasser got to share their experiences in the past. Nasser, of course, being of half Indian descent, growing up in the UK, and obviously making it all the way to international level, representing England. And Michael talking about his experiences from Jamaica, particularly, and then ended up representing the West Indies. Um, and one thing which really resonated with me after the interview is that for many years, growing up in Cape Town, we actually ended up moving to an affluent part of Cape Town, Rondebosch, which is predominantly a white area at the time. This is a good 25 years ago. And I remember a neighbor asking me if I lived in the house that I was walking to, type of thing. And that for years that used to bother me. That stung me because I was a youngster. I didn't quite know how to respond to that situation. And I think just listening to Nasser speak for those few minutes, he just said every one of his experiences he can share with us today dwarfs in comparison to what Michael just spoke about. And
Mhm.
much like that, I would have to say that experience in itself, there were certainly a few in my time. Those sort of dwarf in comparison to what Michael was talking about. Can you imagine being followed in a store because of your color,
Yeah.
because you've been profiled incorrectly?
Yeah.
Can you imagine having an outright fear of the police when, in
Sure.
essence, you're supposed to be protected by these individuals and not have that fear whatsoever?
Yeah.
Um, Absolute anxiety, absolute fear. and I'm so glad that this movement has taken off to the extent it has. And I, we actually said this last night. I had a feeling that cricket would certainly be approaching this topic
Mm.
wholeheartedly. I got the shock of my life to see the Formula One racers even jumping on and sharing their support for the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad that this is catapulted to the point it has at the moment, and I certainly hope it serves in the educational capacity for many people who want to wear. You
Yeah.
know,
Something that really made me emotional as well is when Ebony Rainford Brent spoke. And she was talking about not only her experiences as a woman in cricket, but also as being a black woman in cricket. And it really got me, it really struck close to me what she said. And especially when she said those words, she said, it's time to get focused now. And it's true. And it's something that Michael Holding also spoke about was is we need to go back into a society and re-educate people about this. And it is really something that needs to be spoken about. But there's also
absolutely,
a lot to speak about that there's some good things that we never got to see. And me growing up, I've always heard folklore. So I think it's a perfect time now to bring Aslam onto the show and get his
absolutely.
views about that time and what cricket was like in South Africa and all over the world. So without further ado, evening Aslam, how are you doing?
Good evening, very well. Assalamu alaikum, Khalid, and hello, how are you doing, Ravi? I'm perfect. I'm feeling very well, and I'm looking forward to this next half an hour, 45 minutes with you guys.
Yeah. No, it's perfect. I think we should just go get straight into it. Ravi, you normally have a lot of questions to ask, etc. And I like to leave this period for me to be educated and listening and sitting on this conversation, especially about that period and cricket in that period, because obviously I didn't get to see any of that. I mean, this whole period that you're talking about, I wasn't born in in that era, so I just hear about these stories and this folklore and about players that were playing that time period and how good they were. But I think let me
Absolutely.
start this education. My education starts now. So Ravi, take the wheel.
Well, absolutely. And funnily enough, Khalid, I wasn't in that generation either. I should actually remind you guys about my age. But anyways, be that as it may, just to give Aslam some context and to many fans that might not be aware, I was originally born in Trinidad and Tobago, Port of Spain specifically. And I moved to the country in the early 90s, just at the time of the readmission to international cricket, South Africa's readmission to international cricket, at least. And my exposure at the time was basically the Benson and Hedges Cup at a domestic level, which later became the Standard Bank Cup, as well as the international team at the time. And one thing that resonated with me from 91 to 98, I don't recall seeing that many black faces other than Paul Adams and, of course, Mackay and Teeny. And from what I remember, Faik Davids, along with Hussein Manak, also made an appearance for the Proteas team, or they're part of the squad at least for the '92 World Cup, if memory serves. Um, and I think why it's great to mention is that my reference point of black cricket in South Africa was a very limited, very skewed view, because there was clearly another side to the story. There was a thriving community of cricketers, and dare I say community, I mean it was an enterprise of sorts, because you've had 4 different provinces competing for many years. And thankfully, Assam was kind enough to join us on a show just to give us a fantastic perspective of what used to transpire in those 20, 25 years, 30 years of cricket that took place, particularly in the black community.
Well, good evening. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope I'll be able to do justice to what your guys' searching minds are looking for. What I can say at the beginning, before we get to speaking about the how things evolved in South Africa, I'm interested to hear that you're from Trinidad, because I've had the good fortune of being there twice for Radio 2000. Once during a bilateral series and also once during the World Cup. So fantastic to have you around, and I'm hoping that not just myself, but a lot of other material that's available will sort of enhance the processes as you go forward as now in your adopted country. Before we get to all of that, Michael Holding and what we saw today and what we heard out of Ebony Redford Brent, as well as Nasser Hussain, I think what you got from Michael Holding today was enough is enough. I've done it. I've seen it. I'm in my 60s, or I think he's in his early 70s now, and he's had enough of this. He's seen it all his life. And when is it ever going to come? When is it going to stop? And I can't remember which of the famous athletes in the week last week said the same thing, that it will be big news today, and then it will be brushed under the carpet, and we'll be facing the same type of abuse all over again. So I think it's great to see that the Formula One drivers have done it. It's good to see that even the South Africans this coming week, when they playing that Mandela Cup, that 3TC cricket, they're also going to be sporting Black Lives Matter. I think it's very important, because having spoken to Michael, and just to get to his emotions, growing up in Jamaica, he said to me on a radio interview on Radio 2000, an interview about 3 years ago. He was a guest for about half an hour, and we spoke about the upbringing and what it meant to him, because my focus was, why didn't you sign that blank check to come with the Rebels? And he spoke about the upbringing, and what he felt was so important at that stage was the type of background and the importance of your teachers as well as your parents in your life guiding you to do the right stuff. And he says, had that type of grounding not taken place, interestingly, from the age of 12, 13, and 14, he says it would have been very easy to follow the Bucks. So that's the one story that he told us. So what you saw today was that he was aware of it. He was always cognizant of the issues in South Africa, as many of the others were who didn't come. And even those who came, I mean, they came for the money after all. So I think that was important to just note. And that is why you saw those emotions today, because it's 40 years since then, and nothing's changed really. I remember last week on Twitter when Lewis Hamilton made that statement, and he's now started up what he's calling the Hamilton, it's a committee that's going to be looking into how they can get things like not just at Formula One, but even world sport for that matter, to bring it out into the open. And I remember saying on Twitter that it's great that a world champion is finally speaking about a global issue, and that's important to note. So I just thought those few thoughts came to my mind when you were doing that introduction with Khalid, that I wanted to share that with you.
Can I say it's absolutely surreal to speaking to a man I've been listening to on the radio for the last 20 years. Never thought this would actually happen, but here we are. But yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing those views. And one thing that I've always encountered playing club cricket in Cape Town is often when we go to clubs where diversity is very limited, there'll be varying perspectives on how good an actual player was. Mm-hmm. And for a number of these clubs I played at, Basil D'Oliveira was somebody that was mentioned quite regularly, especially in the Western Cape. He's a hero of St. Augustine's Cricket Club specifically. There's even, for lack of a better term, I think there's a shrine dedicated to his honor as well. Perhaps you can unpack with Khalid and myself as to how good Basil actually was, because we know the story of his international career. But perhaps you could just talk about leading up to that moment. What are the events that sort of led to him eventually representing England?
Well, with Basil, the background is actually a little before him. If you go to the turn of the century, I've made some notes here. The famous story of Crom Hendricks, who was used in the nets with the MCC touring in South Africa before the turn of the century. There's a book that's just been published on Crom Hendricks. So to try and fast forward, he was so good that some of the MCC players said that he's the quickest from both the squads. That means the South African squad. In those days, England used to travel as the MCC. And eventually they thought this is an idea to maybe have him in the nets and bowl at us. He played in a match there as well. He got 4 for 50 or something like that at high pace. And they were so impressed that at one stage they were going to offer him to actually go across to England. What actually happened was there was a writer in South Africa, a white writer, incidentally, And he said that this chap has to actually travel with the South African team and represent South Africa on a tour to the UK. And of course, Cecil John Rhodes and Lord Harris and all these guys got involved. And I think the story has already been told. He was told that he will never travel to England, but he's welcome to go as a baggage master. And he said, not on your life, I will never do that, because that was a great insult. So that was him. And if you fast forward, cricket was segregated from that time already. There was the Colored Cricket Union was actually the first formalized unions, and all this was happening in the Eastern Cape, quite amazingly. Also in the Western Cape area, because it is from there when the army garrisons of the UK actually pitched up. They all obviously wanted to play cricket, and that's how the game was introduced to this country, as the colonists did in the rest of the world. And to just take the whole story into the post-war period, here's young Basil D'Oliveira at 16 and 17 tearing the attacks apart. By the time he left for England, he had scored 82 hundreds. And at one stage, there was an innings of 182 he scored, with 27 sixes and a number of boundaries, and that was also scored in just over an hour. So here was a phenomenon, an absolute phenomenon, but it was only known within the community of the Western Cape. And then, of course, you had those national tournaments, which would take place over a week. So he played one-day matches right through the week in a tournament. And that's where he got his first exposure. And people were exposed to this young phenomenon. So Basil was doing magnificently. He played for Western Province. He was unstoppable. And then into the 60s, through him, Western Province just dominated cricket. And then towards the middle of the 60s, what SECBOC did is, and SECBOC, South African Cricket Board of Control, was a unified body now. It contained all of the non-racial or the black communities, which is the Indian, colored, black, and those days even the Malay were a separate union. So they all amalgamated to form the board, and they then set up a tour to Kenya. So the Kenyan Asians tour, it was as long as 6 weeks. They even went to Tanzania, and they played test matches against Kenya. South Africa won handsomely under Basil D'Oliveira's leadership. They came to South Africa for the return matches, and here too South Africa dominated. And now that things had worked against an international team, so to speak, the South African Cricket Board of Control then decided that since we cannot play against and we can't represent our own country, and this was an overwhelming success, let's see if we can get another national side here. And guess what? They actually had met the West Indians. The great Sani Ramaddin, who was a wonderful spinner in his time, met some of the officials, and they had set the dates and times and the colors and the costumes and the blazers and the ties and everything for that particular tour. And the likes of the 3 Ws, of which Everton Weeks just left us recently. Yeah. Gary Sobers, Conrad Hunt, Ryan Kenhai, Basil Butcher, the whole lot of them were part of that setup, and they were going to come to South Africa. It was really, they had signed everything. The deal was done. But what did happen in South Africa was that the ANC, on the outside, got wind of the fact that this tour is about to take place. The South African government had given it the go-ahead as long as it was only non-whites playing against each other. I think in Cape Town, if my memory serves me well, the Western Province Cricket Club were going to allow them to actually play a test match at the Newlands Cricket Ground. But then, of course, it was called off. And for Basil, it was a real knife through his heart. And I think he had explored and exploited all of the challenges that were put to him. And now he was looking for something more. And he wrote this famous letter to John Arlott, a great cricket commentator, who then, through some way, managed to get him a club called Middleton that would have signed him up in Lancashire. And of course, there's this famous story of Benny Bunsder, an official and a gentleman who actually produced the non-racial or the non-white South African almanac, like the Wisden Almanac. Right. He was the founder and writer of that compiler of it. So he got together. He told Basil, "What I'm going to do here is I'm going to raise the funds. You just get ready to go out there and play the cricket." And of course, that's exactly what happened. Basil pitched up in England. The story about how difficult he found it there, first of all, with the weather. He couldn't understand that the snow could stop play, forget the rain and everything else. And that standing at slips was one thing he never looked forward to, because he prayed that he'd be at somewhere on at third man, because he was fearful that he's going to break his fingers. And yeah, and then what happened, Ravi, is that he sort of seemed to come off. And by the time the season ended, he had scored more runs than Gary Sobers, who was also playing in the same league. And there was this note taken of this young South African. Well, he wasn't so young those days. He was already 29 or 30. So he spent another 4 years at that level, and then got to play for Worcestershire. And Tom Graveney, who was an England player, was very happy to have him there. And then ultimately, with some fantastic performances, where in his being present there, Worcestershire started winning trophies and winning the league and beating some of the better counties. And Basil had done so well that he made the England team. Fast forward that 4 years into his career, and now looking forward to come to South Africa in 1968 to play against the Springboks. We know that the Nationalist Party, of course, didn't make that happen. And whilst I say this, I must mention that there was a lot of cloak and dagger, clandestine stuff that had gone on, not just with the South African government, but even the South African Cricket Union, and also the MCC, and some of the members of Parliament in the UK that tried and did everything to make sure that the tour went ahead, and somehow to not have Basil in there. Of course, the emotional story there is that he was dropped from the squad, and then and everybody called it a crime against humanity, literally. And the likes of the former England captain, Reverend David Shepherd, spoke out against it. No, Reverend David Shepherd captained England. He played for England and scored hundreds for England as well. So Bishop of Liverpool, before he passed away. And so he was the first to voice his dissent against the fact that MCC had dropped him. So did a very young Mike Brearley, and of course John Allett. Why not? Because he's the fellow that actually brought the South African into English cricket. And the story goes that there was a withdrawal. I'm not going to go into too many details. And Basil was then drafted into the team for the last test match of the series. And it was locked at 1-1, I think. And it was important that they actually won this particular one. So what does happen is Basil goes on to score a magnificent 100. But overnight, he was not out on 20. He was dropped just before close of play by the wicketkeeper. And the next morning on his way, when he was leaving home or his hotel, he just told his late wife, who is now late, Naomi, that don't do anything today. Just stay tuned to the television set today, because I'm getting 100. He goes on to get 158, and I'm going to sound emotional. And what does he do? I mean, he literally walks back into the team. There's no way they can drop him. So what that tells you, the deceit that had gone on in the UK was unbelievable, and that they were actually conforming and cowering to the nationalist government of South Africa at that time. Of course, the tour didn't happen, and that actually brought the South African situation into the limelight, because even though they had been banned from the Olympics, but it was the likes of Precious McKenzie, who as a weightlifter had to leave South Africa to represent one of the European countries, I think it was Norway or one of them, in the Olympic Games. So slowly, the whole thing about what is going on in South Africa was had become known to them. I just want to read this to you, because it's very interesting for those older folk that are around and the young guys. E.W. Swanton was the doyen of writers in England, so highly regarded till the day he passed away. I think he even had he was awarded an MBE and an OBE and whatever that they award you in the UK. When South Africa were now all united, and they were forming the United Cricket Board. He was invited as a guest by United Cricket Board of South Africa to sort of cover this historic occasion. And a year later, he wrote the following. He was talking about the South African tour that had taken place, the England tour that had taken place, or was going to take place in South Africa. And he said here, today the overall picture is much more favorable to South Africa in that many more Afrikaners now bring the aggressive philosophy to the game, while the generation of black and colored boys introduced to cricket since apartheid ended will surely be competing for places in the national team. Here is a doyen of writers who's supposed to have his facts on the tip of his fingers, and says and made a comment like this in this article. I actually ruled it, I blocked it out, and I always come across it, and it galls me to think that that's how they viewed South Africa. Whereas our history, and this is where we're coming, that in the 1860s already, cricket was being played in amongst the indigenous people in the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. And then with the diamond rush, they moved to Griquas. And then, of course, with the gold rush, they moved up to Joburg. And basically, so that's why the Basil's story encapsulates that whole sort of politics around the whole sport, around the whole of cricket in South Africa in particular.
Absolutely. And let's cut to 20 years from when Basil made his debut for England. It was during the 60s he made his debut. And he had a marvelous career in spite of the scrapped South African tour. In a manner of speaking, he still scored quite a few hundreds in his time. And unfortunately, he passed on a good couple of years ago. But 20 years later, we saw the likes of a local cricket phenomenon that was around for a while, but actually became more formalized, more structured in a manner of speaking. We've known it as a Howa Bowl. I believe it had another alias known as the Dadabai Cup. Could you perhaps tell us the significance of that, especially among various communities of color within South Africa?
You know, Ravi and Khalid, I must say that, and you, Khalid, would know it because he's South African born and you learning about it. But ours is such a unique situation in the world. I mean, apart from partition in India, Pakistan, which saw something quite unique in that part of the world, ours within the borders of this country, we had incidents and things that happened that were just quite phenomenal. When they were playing cricket in the early 1900s, as I said to you, the colored and the Malay unions formed, and then the Black African unions formed. Indians formed their own, and of course, white cricket had been established, I think, since the 1850s already, if not before then. So ultimately, what happened is that they played in tournaments, segregated tournaments, a Bantu tournament, an Indian tournament, a Malay tournament, and then and they had a colored tournament as well. The NRC trophies, and they had the Barnato Cup and all of those that they challenged for. What did happen is in the 40s, there was talk that we cannot continue this way, because remember, the nationalist government was eventually came into being in 1948. So immediately after that, there was this talk about amalgamation. So after a lot of toing and froing, they then formed a united board, which meant that they all came together and formed the South African Cricket Board of Control. What did happen then was there was an attempt when South Africa got ostracized from the world community and the ICC. By 1970, they were still expecting to go to Australia on that tour after they had 71, after they had just beaten the Australians 4-0 here. But eventually, the Australian says that cannot happen. And as you know, through the 70s, as much as the white establishment tried to get back into international cricket, they realized that that's not going to happen. So what had happened there was by 1975, the white cricket body then approached members of the white cricket body, South African Cricket Association, then approached the members of the Board of Control. That means in Durban, Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, and all the main centers, Johannesburg. And then they got together at a very big meeting here in Johannesburg. I think it may have been at the airport. And they threw this idea around of amalgamating and uniting cricket. they managed to do that. It was favorable to 90% of the cricketing establishment and community in the non-white fold. And of course, it came as a surprise to some people, but it was almost a majority, overwhelmingly accepted that they'll do it. But of course, it was a smokescreen. It was window dressing, and within 4 years of establishing that, it had collapsed. What happened then was there were a number of clubs, very few in Cape Town, in the Cape region, and then PE, Griqualand, and Griqualand West, that's Kimberley, and then up here in Johannesburg. And I think collectively there may have been as many as just 12 teams / clubs that decided that they're not going to be part of it in 1978, and that they're going to need to re-establish a board of control. So with SACBOK having amalgamated with South African Cricket Association and the Black Bantu Association as well, they formed the South African Cricket Board, which was then, which the leader was then Hassan Howa. And as you know, I think he served for about 5 or 6 years, and then Krish Makatush took over until 1991. So SACBOK was an era that started in just towards the end of 1940, early 1950s, till 1975-76. From 78, SACBOK till 1991 were then playing as a national body with the 4 provinces. And that's the era that you're obviously very interested in, because the likes of Faik Davids and Vincent Barnes and company shone through that particular era. And of course, there was some fantastic cricket that was played. And I'm happy to share what any other information that you want. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly, and I'll certainly ask this one, and we'll hand over to Khalid just now. But I'm going to play devil's advocate here, and I've been to a number of cricket clubs in the Western Cape, particularly, and often the question comes, how good is that guy? If the guy of color, is he really that good? Often that will be the debate, and I'm not going to mention the club's names because I'd love to play cricket against him at some point as well. But be that as it may, I'm going to mention a few names to you, and you just, you could certainly give like a bit of a background as to how exceptional they were, perhaps using a few examples. The first name that comes to mind is certainly Jack Manak, followed by Vinnie Barnes. But maybe you could just tackle Jack Manak to begin with.
Well, first of all, I must say that if people stop and ask you just how good was this cricketer or that cricketer, initially you'd wonder, like, hell, you should know better. But the truth is, and this is maybe another aspect that we need to cover, is the failure of the media. But let's leave that for another topic, because I know you're salivating and you want to know about these guys. So if they ask you that question, you need to understand that they were kept in the dark. So if they want to know, you need to actually tell them how good they are, and who would they compare with. And they were a hell of a pair, those two. They played one season for Transvaal, and they were unstoppable. The only time Transvaal beat Western Province here in Lenasia was when Vinny took 8 wickets for 42 runs against his old buddies. He wrecked them here at the stadium on one of the flattest pitches in the whole country as far as provincial pitches were concerned in Howa Bowl. He was absolutely magnificent. I'm going to give you an incident. We were playing against Actonville Spurs when he was brought up to play club cricket here as a professional, Vincent Barnes. And I opened the innings, and fortunately I was the non-striker. And within the first 2-3 overs that Vinny had bowled, just as you know, Dale Steyn, high pace with swing. I saw this from the non-striker's end, the ball hitting around middle and leg, the batsman playing down towards that side, and the top of the off stump flying out of the turf. And those were 2 of our opening batsmen. One of them was a Transvaal opener, my cousin Faisal Saleh. And to have watched it
how fast was he? I mean, I know we had 3 guns that time, but I mean, how quick do you think he was, Wallace?
Ravi, I was asked this question in 2015, and in the beginning of the year, by one of the quartet of bowlers. Nazir Dinda, who is late now, unfortunately, was part of that bowling attack. And he asked me, he says, now that you're watching so much of cricket and everything else, where do you place? He was talking about Jack and Vinny and all the other guys, not himself. And Barney, of course. And I said, listen, these guys were definitely in the mid 140s. Absolutely. I kept to Jack Minnick and Pani Muhammad and Nazir Dinda for 2 full seasons. And I can tell you that, these hands stayed blue till Wednesday, only to get ready for the next bit of beating over the next weekend. They were quick, they had guile, they had brilliance, and you can't be taking over 200 wickets at under 16 and not be a class act. And that was Vincent Barnes. He was absolutely fantastic. He was one of the great sights that you would watch running into bowl. A beautiful action, high arm action, athletic. He was, I don't know if Khalid knows this, but he had the choice of playing soccer, professional soccer or cricket.
Mhm.
Luckily, he chose cricket because today it's been good for him as well. He's been employed for a long time and he's done well for himself. So he was definitely
Well, I can tell
in
you
a class of his own.
the only thing we don't like about Vinnie Barnes is the fact that he's a devout Man City supporter. We're a Man United group, unfortunately, for good old Vinnie.
I'll just tell you very quickly that for a number of years when we were in the company of Vinny, and he kept on going about Man City, but remember they were mid-table and they were never really anywhere, and you wondered, but like, why Man City? And now he's of course got his nose up high.
Right.
He's got the bragging rights. Why not? So he was definitely very good. Now my cousin Munir Saleh straddled both the eras, the Segbok era, and he played for Seg B Transvaal, and he played for the National Select 11 as well. And obviously those questions are posed to him, like how would you compare these guys to the likes of Hussein Ayub and Jeff France and all of those guys who played? And he says that, listen, Vincent Barnes was an absolutely class act. He would have made it in any era. So that just tells you how really good he was. That he'd have survived in that company in the Segbok era as well.
Now,
Jack Minnick was a
there's plenty of names I could give you. There's plenty of other names I could certainly try and attempt to test you on. But I would happily like to give Khalid an opportunity to ask you a few questions of his own.
So
all right, let's just do Jack Minnick very quickly. The youngest 200 wickets in provincial cricket in South Africa. It may even be in all cricket in South Africa. That means non-white and white cricket. He was a phenomenon. He bowled in-swinging deliveries that at high pace. That when batsmen were getting their front foot wide across to well left him, the ball kept coming back and hitting the stumps. He was at times unplayable, and eventually got to 200 and some odd wickets. And so he holds that record, the youngest and the fastest to 100 wickets. And there's a lovely story about him and the late Saeed Majid. In his debut season against Western Province, Jack Minnick has got 6 of the 8 wickets that have fallen, and Western Province, who normally bang Transvaal all over the place, were about 60 for 8.
Oh my God!
Saeed Majid was in the middle, and here the 17-year-old has a bit of a chirp to the big man. And he told the fellow, go back and bowl. He got 100. Western Province scored 200 and plenty. They bowled Transvaal out for about 70 and 112. They won outright. And it was a quick lesson for Jack Minnick.
This is actually
don't
covered
say too much
in
else.
Khalid's other show. This is definitely covered between Zaire and Joey Rusty. They mentioned this last week, I think.
Okay, terrific.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, very
Khalid, yeah.
Yeah, so that's obviously, it's interesting that Ravi actually brought the football, because I make sort of similarities, not exactly 100% similarities, but when I was I'm a massive Man United fan. I had a Man United publication as well. So when
My brother invited home every night.
So when I did my research on United and the history, obviously listening to a lot of interviews, etc., they spoke about someone's particular called Duncan Ferguson, and from that era, from the Busby Babes era. And the way they spoke about Duncan Ferguson was about how amazing he was, and everything about him. And so when I was thinking about how they explain these players, a lot of times in Cape Town, when I listen to people talk about certain players, they talk about Saeed Majid like this, and they speak about Lefty Adams. I want you to maybe give me some insight into those two players, because they've become almost like folklore to us, because I never got to see them play, but you always hear about them, and you always hear about Duncan Edwards and all of those guys from the Busby Babes era that we never got to see,
Yes.
that especially from the Munich air crash era, and we never got to see them play. But now, similarly to obviously Said Majid and Lefty Adams, etc. Can you maybe give me some insight into that?
I'll answer or I'll respond to that with a question. Khalid, how good was Adrian Caper?
I can maybe answer that one.
Yeah, go for it.
I thought he was pretty damn good. I saw him sweep slog Monanto Hayward out of Boland Park, and Monanto was coming at him at about 150 plus.
And he was an all-rounder, right?
I never really rated him as an all-rounder. To be fair, I only seen him more as a batsman, but I believe he could bowl a bit as well.
Now, he bowled a bit, and he was considered an all-rounder. I can tell you now that Said Majid was better than Adrian Caper. Faster, more belligerent, hit the ball much longer than he ever did. And he was a colossus of a cricketer. On one occasion here against the SECB Select 11 were playing against the champions Eastern Province at the Lenasia Stadium. I was fortunate enough to watch that and cover that match for the newspapers. And the two of them both got hundreds. And it was till today, apart from Rohan Kenhai's time at the Lenasia Stadium and one innings that Graham Pollock had played for Old Edwardians against Kohinoor in that period, which I spoke about earlier, the failed amalgamation era. Nobody's hit the ball harder and a bigger distance than those two gentlemen in Said as well as Yunus Thomas. But Said was just unbelievable. I mean, when he bowled, he had the energy from first ball to the last over of the day. We know that he was an absolutely magnificent rugby player. So when it came to stamina and everything else, the guy just had it. But he was born to play anything that was round. With anything that was round, he was an absolute genius. And the other cricketer you had talked about was Lefty Adams. Lefty Adams was a classy bowler. I happened to see him as a youngster. So
I'm guessing he was a left arm seamer, right?
Yes, left arm. Yeah. Let's just say that he had a better mouth than the deliveries that he put together, because he was one of those that would walk into the change room of the opposition team on the morning of the play and would tell them that you guys are going to be bowled out for 77, and so, and then he'd lead the team to do that. He says, because when he goes out, he'll tell Western Province, "Ek het net die vir die mense gesê. Now we better do that out here in the middle." So Lefty talked the game, but he even played the game. He was magnificent. I had a chat with Harun Rolgert, and I asked him about Lefty. And he says that amongst the captains that he played with and against, although it was Lefty was towards the end of his career, he rated Lefty. So he was an inspirational captain. He always got the support. And yet, even though he had this demeanor of a court jester, there was the serious side to Lefty that you'd be missing that at your own peril, because there was a crafty brain there that was after you. And that's why they were dominant during his period as captain. And he even took them into the SECB era, where then I think it was Amin Jabbar or one of the other guys that took over captaincy from him. But they learned a lot under him, and he was definitely an icon, not just for Western Province, but everybody looked forward to watch him in provincial cricket wherever he played.
So, I mean, the big global players at the time, if I'm getting the timelines correct, please, if I'm mistaken, please correct me. The guys that come to mind is Viv Richards, obviously from the West Indies. We know him, his exploits quite well, two-time world champion as well. We know about Alan Border. They became the 1987 World Cup champions a few years down the line. From India, you had Sunil Gavaskar as well. How good was Lefty Adams? Do you think he was capable of uprooting the stumps of any of those batsmen? particularly?
It's a far-reaching question because those players that you've mentioned are they're on another sphere. So I'd be crazy to maybe even answer that directly. But what I will say is that Lefty's self-belief, and I think maybe this question should go to the likes of those that played with him in both those eras, but more so maybe in the Sekbok era. And they will tell you that his self-belief, and whenever I've chatted with him at the Western Province, at Newlands, on a number of occasions, I was always trying to fish things out of him. And he was always very, very happy to talk about cricket and his own cricket. And I think that confidence and that self-belief that I can do anything you can do would perhaps may have made him a successful player. In my book, that's how I would answer it. So that means against any player in any era, he was up to it to take up the challenge.
Incredible. Because I mean, yeah, it's like I said before, I liked it. I liked it too. Hearing stories about Duncan Edwards as well from that era. It's like the similar thing when I'm sitting and listening to people talking about Lefty and Said. There's obviously leading into that era and the end of that era. The I know you would have known. We spoke to obviously someone like Fanny de Villiers that spoke about that time period when domestic cricket was in that era. I wanted to ask you about the domestic cricket at that particular time and leading into obviously that before with Faik Davids obviously going to the World Cup. He's told me his stories about him going to the World Cup and not being able to play, etc.
Yes.
And told before he even got on the plane, being told that he's not going to play. He's just there for obviously conventional for the reason. Yeah. So can you give me some insight into that and what it was like? Do you think that Faik Davids was on that level to be able to compete against the world's best?
At that time in 1991, when cricket was unified in South Africa, you would had to rate Faik Davids as one of the better batsmen or best batsmen at SECB. And you always felt that he was good enough to play provincial cricket. That means for the United Western Province Cricket Board. But as we saw what happened in most parts of the world, and maybe to an extent we heard from Nasser Hussain and also Michael Holding about some similarity in the thought processes, that are they good enough or would they be good enough? So even though you had all the records, and I think Faik was one of those where when at the time of unity, he actually got hundreds in league cricket against some of those bowlers as well. But they kept putting him in the B side. So what happened was, and it's the same thing that happened to the chaps up here in the Transvaal, then Transvaal. And to me, that was a disservice, not so much from and this may not go down too nicely in most parts of our country, but I remember making that observation early in the 90s, that part of the blame was with our guys who then put there as selectors. But then you have to ask yourself the question, were they just, just a number, just another name on the list as far as the selection committee was concerned? They never really put in the arguments for our chaps to actually play at provincial level. So with Faik Davids, I think Jack Minnock and as well as Harun Lorgat himself at the time, Vinnie Barnes without a doubt, Nazim White as a wicketkeeper, I remember him. In an era where we now admire the fact that there's wicketkeepers who can bat and perhaps hold their own in any position in the batting lineup, Nazim was one of those. So he could have easily perhaps replaced Richie Ryle or whoever, but it wasn't going to happen. It didn't happen. And whilst there was this euphoria about celebrating mixed cricket at that time, what happened was eventually by the middle 90s towards 97, 98, there was this big endeavors that took place around the country and people started speaking the truth about how they actually feel. The whole selection issue was brought to light. And there was a lot of heart-to-heart and open chat about how our people felt. And from that emerged the Transformation Charter. The charter that then guided the rest of the cricket in South Africa as to how to then adopt the transformation policies and everything else. And that was necessary, because had that not happened, then the likes of Mackay and Tini and Paul Adams would have just been a story for the people around the block. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to get into two questions before I give it back to Ravi. There's two questions from the fans over here, and one is from Mohammed Majid, who wants to know if Aslam can compare the legendary Mr. Hussein Ayub to a bowler of the current era, who would it be?
I must just mention very quickly that he's been unwell for in the last 2 years, and just recently, last week, in fact, he was discharged from hospital. He's also just published a book of his own. I think it was launched about 2 weeks ago. So it'll be an interesting read. How would you compare Hussein Ayub? So difficult in that, because he played most of his cricket at a top level when they were still playing on matting wickets. The whole transformation and the whole adjustment to play on turf pitches, which you never played on in your lifetime, was never easy. But what Hussein was able to do was adapt. And even on the flat pitches, the Lenasia Cricket Stadium, by the way, in the 70s, Yaqub Umar and even Bravo Jacobs and Rushdie and Said and all of them would have told you they waited to play in Lenasia because it was a flat bed. You could come and score a lot of runs here. And Hussein Ayub used to extract bounce and movement and everything else on that. To compare him to somebody of the modern ilk, I'm trying actually very hard to try and imagine somebody with a similar action. And somehow the bowler that comes to mind is Craig, not Macmillan, what's his name? Craig Matthews. Craig Matthews, the Western Province, and he played a few matches for South Africa as well in the early 90s. Right. Craig Matthews was one of the type that I would maybe compare to Hussein Ayub. He was certainly a fantastic bowler. He had energy for Africa. He had the heart of gold. And just to indicate to you what a type of a mental makeup he had, that he was, I'm not going to say he was a slouch with the bat, but you never expected much out of him until and when your team was 9 wickets down, either looking to force a draw or to win. And Hussein Ayub would be there with his middle order batsmen, making sure that Transvaal got there. So that's the type of attitude that he played with. And of course, then he became a very famous coach and coached in Africa and was part of Baker's cricket. But certainly a legend. And I'm sure that his book will be going around the country and it will be interesting to read.
And the next question is from Nim Naidu. He says, "Hi guys, we'd love to know Aslam's thoughts on Babu Ibrahim."
Babu Ibrahim was a class act. They got so used to him at Sekpok level that yes, Babu is a threat. He's this wonderful left arm bowler. He bowled the arm ball as well. And then he also bowled the seam up ball, so it would be the almost like a flipper, the left arm spinner's flipper that is so famous with the leg break bowlers. So he had a great variety. He was very dependable, and the likes of Yaqub Umar, who captained him, and would obviously have him operate from one end because he was just so good. The guys had got so used to him that Babu was just another very good provincial player who would do well for Natal and play in those end-of-season matches and hold his own. And then, of course, in 1976, when South Africa were in isolation, there were a number of, those days it wasn't rebel tours that took place. There were these cricket benefactors, but of course they were benefactors for white cricket. And they would bring in the Wolf Isaacs 11, and all of them would bring, and Derek Robbins would then bring teams out to South Africa. And there was one that actually came through, which was called the International Wanderers. And they were a power-packed team with current test players, Greg Chappell, Ian Chappell, Dennis Lilly, Max Walker. There was Paul Sheehan. I'm just trying to think of some of the batsmen. And Ian Redpath, I think he had also still come at that stage. But nevertheless, what had happened is when they were looking to play those international matches, One of the things late Rashid Farache said, and he was obviously very much ahead of his time as an administrator, is that if we give this a go-ahead, now that we're playing this mixed cricket in South Africa, you need to play 3 players of color. So just think about this, right? And there was tremendous amount of dissent from the white fraternity that shouldn't happen. And what did happen then was Babu Ibrahim gets to play the match at Kingsmead and gets 6 for 60, and South Africa win that match. And here they were going absolutely ballistic and nuts about this left arm spinner who's come and bamboozled this international ranked team, and South Africa win handsomely. And here he's well, those days they didn't have man of the match, but Babu was the star of the show. And so that what I'm saying to you is that whilst at Sekbok level he was this very good cricketer, here playing on an international front, he showed what his real mettle was. So the ability to raise his game was perhaps something we didn't know too much about Babu, is what he was able to do. But I want to share something about that particular incident because I made a note here. And Richie Benaud was the manager of that international cricket team. So you're going to love this, Khalid, because he says here, earlier Sekbok had been plunged into a crisis of conscience when, along with the South African Cricket Board, were invited to jointly run the tour with the South African Cricket Association. Despite strong opposition from some quarters within Sekbok, and with Varachia's future clearly in the balance, a resolution supporting the tour was passed by a vote of 11-6 to conditionally support the tour. So it happened. Interesting to know that the African board went against the resolution and played the Wanderers team in a separate match. Okay, the tour received great support, but some white officials blamed the losses on the fact that the South African team had weak links. Richie Benaud, the ex-Australian captain, was the manager of the tourists. In his autobiography, Anything But an Autobiography, published in 1996, this was 20 years after that tour, Benaud exposed reservation of one white selector and the privately prejudiced position most of them held. He takes up the story as follows. The same night, at the post-match reception at the ground, one of the white selectors, smarting bitterly from the defeat, told the world that this was the last bloody time they would allow themselves to be forced into choosing 3 non-white players. In future, it was going to be a test. It was to be a test of strength. When the teams got to Johannesburg, South Africa would have their best possible team in the field, and they would carve up bloody Lily and stuff the rest of them, including me. That's not the end of the story. It took only moments to sort that out, with the same wording as the morning misunderstanding, but I waited until the right moment in Joburg to let Dennis know about it. Dennis being Dennis the Menace Lilly. This is what this guy said.
Headband.
So, yeah, and to just go back to that particular match, because guess what? We went to watch it, and Graham Pollock scored one of the great hundreds that I've ever seen against an attack. In the first innings, they were well ahead. And that comment, of course, was then passed on to Dennis Lilly. And this is what happened. It only took moments to sort that out. Okay, he told Dennis Lilly about it, right? He took 7 for 27 against the South African 11 and gave the crowd a rare moment of cricketing joy with some of the finest bowling seen at the Wanderers. It would have been better too had he been able to bowl out, listen to this, the little dark-haired batsman who showed enormous courage against him and refused to give an inch. This was Tiffy Barnes, and he showed a rare brand of fight in combating Lilly and the other Wanderers bowlers. Batting at number 8, he got 32. A rampant Lilly couldn't get past our little man, Tiffy Barnes. You want to know of a legend? For me, he probably ranks as in the top 3 as the best we've ever produced. I thought that would be interesting.
That actually ties in nicely to
I've
the
got one more
question I
question
asked earlier.
Ravi, I've got one more question from the fans because I just want to get that out of the way quickly. What a great show. Listening to Aslam talking about the greats of yesteryear is truly amazing. I grew up learning about these guys and wished I could have watched one of them in action. Does Aslam have any record of Shukri Conrad and also beloved cricket club, namely Montrose Cricket Club of those years?
Montrose.
Okay,
Now a couple of those guys.
let's do Shukri Conrad. Shukri Conrad was controversial in his young days because at the time of 1976, when that whole merger took place, Shukri obviously was one of those amongst a few others that didn't come across. So he wasn't too well received in Sec B cricket. But aside from that, you always knew that if he had the Conrad name, that he's going to have to live up to something quite special because his dad was an absolute phenomenon. He was brilliant. And so there was always this curiosity, not just with us young guys, but even the chaps that played against Dickie Conrad, that what's this fella all about? So eventually he gets to the Lenasia Stadium, and he was an all-rounder, but stocky and tough and very good. I only saw him in that particular match at the stadium, so I can't make much of him. I can't remember much of that day, but I know that he was a robust cricketer. He would give everything, and of course, you learned in later years that there was a hell of a lot of cricket brain up there as well. But he was absolutely fantastic. And I think had he made his choice earlier to come across to Sec B cricket, he would have probably had a more checkered career in Sec B colours and may have had provincial colours to his name. Having stayed on the other side, he ultimately remained a club cricketer. But you've got to talk about his dad, Khalid, because you talk to anyone, and I remember my late brother when we're playing little cricket on the stupo in the yard or at the zoo lake. Then I'm Richards and Barry Richards, and guess what? My brother used to say I'm Dickie Conrad, because those punches off the back foot and the pulls and the cuts that he played, and the fact that he could take on any attack was a sight to behold. I saw him score 60 as a youngster. I must have been about 11 or 12 years old in the early 70s. But that innings is etched in my memory. And there's a very good story that Muhammad Ali talks about Dickie Conrad, that he also stayed on the, let's call it the white side. And Garth LaRue had just come back from the Packer series, and Garth LaRue, incidentally, was one of the top fast bowlers in amongst all of those West Indians and all of the great fast bowlers of that era that played there. And he had come with this big reputation now that he is definitely a world beater. And Dickie Conrad couldn't wait for a club match to get going to play against Garth. And they tell us, and please do me a favor, try and get people to tell you about this. He got one of the most belligerent hundreds that they ever saw against Garth LaRue. So, the cricketers of that era, I mean, everyone you talk to, they have this habit of saying, oh, he would have played for South Africa. Oh, he would have made it for South Africa. But Tiffy Barnes, Dickie Conrad, Solly Chotia were in another class. And to me, I reckon that they certainly would have played international cricket.
That's amazing. So Ravi, I'm going to give it back to you. I think that was incredible.
Absolutely. So Aslam, I think part of being in the media industry, as well as having discussions and some debates like these, the transformation agenda is often brought up. And it's great that you gave us the history of cricket in South Africa, especially within the Black community as well, to give a nice background, especially for the younger cricket fanatics that are watching the show tonight.
Mm-hmm.
I've encountered quite a few statements in my time as a club cricketer, as a fan, and sometimes, just going to the stadium generally. And often the reference point by elder statesmen is that transformation is important. You need to play your best possible team at all times. The younger folk would just want the best possible South African team out there on the floor. I suppose my question to you is, why is transformation important? And I'm asking you this because, with particular reference to the fact that there are younger fans that don't quite understand the history as to how we got to this particular point.
As I said earlier, that after the euphoria of the whole amalgamation of sport and the whole country and democracy and everything else, and the fact that South Africa went to that World Cup in '92 and did well, and then in '95 the rugby guys win the World Cup, and in '96 the soccer guys win the African Nations Cup, and everything is just hunky-dory in South Africa. Mandela is this revered leader going all around the world. And as a nation, we certainly held our noses up high, our chests out, but there were underlying issues. And something that had taken root for, close to 300 years, how are you going to eradicate that over a euphoric period of 5 and 6 years? So it was always going to be difficult. The white establishment have ruled. They sponsor the cricket. They own everything that you see there, the grounds, the clubs. The know-how is there. They know what television is all about. They know what the media is all about. So when our chef stepped in there, it was almost like a door had opened to a completely new world. But what the key factor there was, what about the cricketers? And how are they being left out? I mean, in the Transvaal here, the likes of Hussein Manak, my nephew Ahmed Umar, Jack Manak, Nazir Dinda, Iqbal Khan, Imran Munshi. I mean, all these guys really struggled to break that mold. And as I said earlier, some of our selectors didn't do justice to those boys. They didn't fight hard enough for them. And so to me, the point I was going to make here was you realize then that in order to take cricket and the whole administration to another level, you needed to get down to brass tacks and the honest facts about what's going on. And that the people from the non-racial or the non-white community, that's black, colored, and Indian, were not happy with what was going on. And that's why, as I said, the Transformation Charter and the Kota system, as it was then called, it was absolutely necessary. It is still a necessary evil, I will call it now, is because the question of trust remains there. That every time 2 steps and 3 steps are taken forward, you'll get some idiot that will take the whole thing a step or 2 back. And I think until and when that whole question of trust is finally eradicated, and then there's an equal, how can I put it, that your mindset is there, that we need to do this as a collective. I must say that having said all of that and being quite vociferous about it, that I have also noted in the last number of years that there is a buy-in, that there is a embracing of that thought processes, but it needs to happen at all levels. Here's my big issue that I'm going to take with administrators. If you want the under-19 team to do well, don't look at what's going on at national level and winning the World Cup and that, and why aren't there 6 and 8 and 20 black or non-white cricketers making up the national side. What you need to do is go back to the grassroots, to your cricket weeks in December and January, and some of which that happens, I think, mid-year as well, and look at how all that is administered. Now, what is happening is, in this modern era, it's not just the cricketer that's looking to make his way into making cricket a future, but the coaches are doing the same. There was a period where the coaches would actually let go the players and they'd go on to become great cricketers on their own and make all the money and all the records on their own. But here, the coaches are now also looking to take their careers forward. Right. And now what happens is, as time has evolved and as this whole issue of transformation has taken root, they found ways in which to try and find this as a workable entity. And one of it is the scorecard. Now, I don't know if you guys are aware of the scorecard, but each union, each age group, each cricket week, whichever one it may be, is given and each team are given a scorecard, or the selectors or the coach is given a scorecard in amongst how many players of color are you selecting, how many spinners, and all of that, if you know what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. So what's happening now is the coaches, in order to satisfy that scorecard, are doing a disservice to the real good cricketers. So if you are wondering why Lawrence Mahatlane on 3 attempts at the under 19 World Cup since the one that they won, they've come short. He's not given the material that is expected to do well. They don't have to win the World Cup, but you can't be dumped out in the first round and be beaten by Nepal and all of these other associate countries when we're a leading nation. So the bottom line here is that your selection at your school's level, at your cricket weeks, need to be fair. Pick the right player of color there. He's the one that's going to represent South Africa and make life easy for the coaches up there, not the one who's answering to a scorecard of one particular coach or selector. So I think that is an area which needs to be addressed.
You think there's a break in succession? Do you think it's a break in succession? The channel is just not doing its job?
No, Ravi. What I'm saying is if Khalid Mohidin is good enough, but because I'm selecting him as a number 6 batsman in my team because I think there's 2 or 3 other guys that I'm pushing for. So Khalid doesn't get enough time to bat in this. Everything is 50 overs and 20 overs today. So by the time he bats, he's batting for the last 3 or 4 overs. He's never going to get a chance to shine.
You're judging him on.
How are they going to judge him? How are they going to say, but he's better than those? And the other coaches are doing the same thing. So what is happening is guys who are being favored are in the main making those squads. And I know it sounds almost childish to say something like that, but if you look at the quality of cricket that's played in the week, and then you wonder how come they can't take that to another level and produce the type of cricket, then you have to look for the easy answers. And to me, that's the one. Because they're trying to satisfy the scorecard, we are not getting the right type of guys coming through the system. Then what you're saying is what makes sense, is that then you're filtering the right type of guys to get into the system. Under Ray Jennings, he also had 3 attempts at winning the Under-19 World Cup. But in that time, you didn't have so many of these cricket weeks with all these regulations. So eventually, he would even have a say as to who would be part of his squads for the trials. And from there, they would then pick the youngsters out and play for South Africa. So ultimately, out of that Under-19 team, you saw the likes of Kagiso Rabada and also Markram, the 2 that just come to mind. There have been a number of others who've actually made it into provincial cricket and doing very well. But you go back to 1995, David de Brugge, Boeta de Bonar, Mark Boucher, Mackenzie, Makai Ntini. There's a few that are missing that played. And no, Adams wasn't in that particular setup. But you get what I'm saying. 7 or 8 out of those players played international cricket. And at least, I think, 70% of them played at provincial level. So it's not something that we're sucking out of our thumb that's new. It's happened, it's worked. Just be fair and do things right. And I think we'll get things right, hopefully in the near future.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect way to sign off the show. Ravi, I'm just going to give you a last opportunity just to say one more thing to Aslam. And Aslam, obviously, after that, you can give you any word that you want to give to those out there.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo your sentiments here, Khalid. Aslam, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This has been highly informative, enlightening. I'm just seeing the comments explode here on YouTube, and I think there's a furor of questions. We'll certainly get them through to you offline, and hopefully we can somehow publish the responses to the fans. But normally we give our guests a fantastic opportunity to share what they're busy doing at the moment, project-wise or business-wise, and the best way for the fans to get in touch with you. So over to you, sir.
Right. In the lockdown, I've been asked to watch, just before we got on air with you, it's Wednesday night, it was my turn to do the dishes. Okay. What I'd like to just mention before we go is that somehow in this discussion, because we're talking about that particular era, we've almost had black cricket go over our head. Now, what I just want to say is that you spoke about Frank Hoho off air when we were still preparing. Just to say that, this whole perception that, as I read Mr. Swanton saying that black cricket will take root now in 1996, and the colored and the black players will learn, and soon we'll see them in South African colors. How uninformed was the poor man? Luckily, he's now not on earth anymore. But what I want to say is that there were so many. And in the time that I actually published this book of mine, Across the Great Divide, in 2003 for the Gauteng Cricket Board, I had a number of these black cricketers that I interviewed at the Wanderers Cricket Ground. They had summoned all of them to the offices and we had meetings. There was a gentleman by the name of Surgeon Zetu. And he amazed me because in our second meeting, he had come with a pile of writing paper with notes. He had gone back to his personal notes of 30 years before that, okay?
Sure.
2003, 30 years before that. And he brought that to me. And there were a whole lot of results of weekend matches that were played. Now, what had happened is when Bantu cricket had taken root in different parts of the country, they had to play separately because that was how the country was governed. And then, of course, as I said, in 48, it was a rule, a written rule that you had to play segregated sport. And they had some fantastic players. I've got a whole list of names, but I'm not going to do all that now because we're short of time. But what I'll say to you is that the disservice to black cricket was sacrilegious, was one of the worst crimes committed against any player or any race for that matter, because they had played good cricket. My uncle, who is now 87, played for the South African Indians and for Transvaal, and is renowned in the cricketing circles around the country of that era. Was even a manager of the Transvaal team that won the Darabai Trophy, by the way. And I asked him about Frank Hoho. He says he scored 100 for the Bantu 11 against the Indian 11 at Natalspruit. It was one of the best hundreds I've ever seen. This guy was 5'3". And the story goes that he was so good as a cricketer. 100 hundreds, by the way. He was known as the Black Bradman, the Dusty Bradman. They called him Dusty Bradman in South Africa. And Donald Bradman, of course, as we know. And then Mr. Headley, who was out in the West Indies, he was known as the Black Bradman. And the West Indians tell you no.
That's right.
Donald Bradman was actually the white Bradman,
Right.
the white Headley.
That's
Right?
right.
So Frank Hoho was in a class of his own. He scored 100 hundreds. He got a 240. I made a note here somewhere in a provincial match, and they said that from the African community, the Bantu community, as they would call it that time, even though they knew nothing about cricket. Now listen to this, but they heard that Hoho is playing. He's here at Natalspruit, or he's at Fitas, or he's playing in Newlands. You got to go and watch him. So non-cricketers would go and see who's this Bradman chap, because everywhere we go, they're only talking about Dusty Bradman, Frank Hoho. So he was in a class of his own. There's a lot written about him by Andre Odendaal as well in his book, Prof. Yeah, the African Game, right? And for me, where the story takes a terrible turn is when the Group Areas Act, and this will be interesting for you, Ravi, when the Group Areas Act took hold, you were told from Johannesburg you have to move to Lenasia, to Azadville, as Indian community. As a black community, you had to move out of Sophia Town and Kliptown to go into Soweto and so on. What that did is it disintegrated a lot of the cricket. But the blacks suffered the most because they were then dependent on jobs on the mines. And because you were on the mines, you played cricket. And to think that the NRC Cup that was played in the 40s was sponsored, it was all sponsored by, I think, Anglo-American, so that they'd have their miners playing cricket. So what had happened in Transvaal in particular, and this is why it's so sad, that it had completely disintegrated within the black community. And when that had taken root in the 60s and by the middle 70s, cricketers who were in their 50s and 60s, black cricketers, in order to keep the game going, continued to play, but there was no one coming through. Their friends were actually dying off. So you couldn't make sides anymore. And now suddenly you've gone to Force Lewis and you've gone to different parts of the province. They couldn't make teams anymore. And the game had died a sad death. So for many reasons, the transformation is vital. It's important that we keep our eye on the ball, but we need honest brokers to be running our cricket. The problem with cricket at the moment is because there's money at the very high level, people are trying to get there for sinister reasons. And if you don't have cricket at heart, then go and make your money somewhere else.
It's not going to work.
It's not going to work. So, I maybe would just like to leave you guys on that particular note.
100%. And sorry, Aslam, on that note, is there a way the fans can reach out to you? You mentioned Twitter earlier. Is there any other platform they can reach out to you?
Yeah, Twitter is at cricket. What's my Twitter handle now? Have I forgotten? Yeah, it's Aslam Cricket.
We can share that.
Yeah, it's Aslam Cricket. Yeah, and the email address is Aslam Cricket, ASLAM Cricket, one word, at polka, polka.co.za. I don't have no website. That's the only way I communicate.
That's perfectly fine, and I'm being very presumptuous here, Khalid, as well. But I'm sure we would love to have you on the show again. You're quite right. You hit the nail on the head. There's just so many players to cover, so many stories, and I would certainly like to welcome the opportunity again to have a discussion with you.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier to focus on media because you guys are all now part of the new breed. I mean, I've seen Khalid all over the place, but he's always got his equipment all over the place. Through all of the stuff, he's greeting you hello and goodbye. And, so it'll be great to talk to you guys and maybe even see how we can take make this media space an important one. One that is vital, that will make a positive difference to the country. And I think we have very few who are doing that. And some of them are embedded journalists. Listen to me very carefully. So whether it's if it's a whole lot of white guys running your cricket, they have embedded journalists there. If you've got black guys doing it, there's embedded journalists there. And that's media in print and in electronic. And until those honest brokers don't sort of do what we expect a journalist to do, then we're going to continue to have problems as we are seeing right now at Cricket South Africa.
Absolutely.
So thank you guys. Thank you guys. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you for getting involved in the comment section. Thank you to Aslam. Thank you to Ravi for giving us this amazing, insightful, and innovative, of course, a very, very innovative conversation. So everybody out there, you know what to do. You have to like this video. Obviously, put your comments in the comment section below if you watch it later on. Obviously, click the notification bell and share this with all your friends and family because I think these messages and these stories need to be heard. So without further ado, see you guys. Welcome and stay safe during this period. Also, don't forget to tune in next week for another episode of Legends with Ravi. Cheers, guys.